Welcome to the Not to Be Missed Lunch, where the title of the event is spot on, as we have four terrific authors that are going to be talking about their books today, and you really don't want to miss this. I'm Carol Fitzgerald from bookreporter.com. I'm also the host of the Book Reporter Talks To video podcast series. Spent a lot of time talking to authors, so looking forward to this today. I've enjoyed exploring these four authors and look forward to introducing them to you. We have Michael Farris-Smith, we have Marie Benedict, Dewaine Farria, and Chris Whitaker will be joining us shortly. He's actually doing another virtual event. Yes, we can be in multiple places these days. A little bit of housekeeping to start out. Thanks to our conference sponsors whose support has helped make this event happen: HarperCollins, Hachette, Simon & Schuster, Sourcebooks, Blackstone Publishing, Scholastic, and Penguin Random House. Please note that we're all to follow the conference's code of conduct, and we are all considered competitors, and there can be no discussion of terms or boycotts. So please read our policies on the New Voices, New Rooms website. So for this event, what we're going to do, if you have questions for the authors, we're going to ask them to please put them down in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. The plan here is that I'm going to introduce each author, give a short bio about them, and then I will ask them to share about their work. Then I will pose some questions to them. And at the end, we're going to turn to your questions. Now, you know that moment when you're in your store and the author finishes speaking, you say, and now who has any questions? And no one raises their hand. Well, this is your moment to make sure that you're out there giving questions, because I'm turning to look to you. And if not, that I'll have to just keep going. So I'm going to go and introduce our first guest to you. Everyone else is going to pop off screen, and they will be back to chat with us shortly. Our first guest is Dewaine Farria, and he is the author of Revolutions of All Colors. You know, I've wanted to be able to see covers of books this week, so I'm going to share the ones that I have with you. So here we go, Revolutions of All Colors, which is coming from Syracuse University Press on November 15th. This novel was selected by Tobias Wolff as the winner of Syracuse University's 2019 Veterans Writing Contest. As a U.S. Marine, Dewaine served in Jordan and Ukraine. And first, let me just pause and thank you for your service for doing that. He holds an MFA in creative writing from the Vermont College of Fine Arts, and his writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, The Rumpus, and Afropunk. He is now a senior security and emergency services specialist for the Asian Development Bank, with responsibility for the safety and security of the organization's 44 field offices across Asia and the Pacific. And he is joining us today from Manila, where it is now 1 a.m. So welcome, Dewaine. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for that really kind introduction. Should I just go straight into my my bid?
You know what? I'm going to inject one thing here. If you go out to his website, you can see fabulous photos from all these things that he has done through the years. I was out there perusing that this morning. So if you want to see what Dewaine's been over the last couple of decades, there's some great pictures out there to go take a look at. So yes, I did go out and do a little bit of research on you. So let's start by your introducing us to Revolutions of All Colors.
Sure. My novel, Revolutions of All Colors, traces two generations of an American family across the globe, from Oklahoma, where my father retired and where I attended college, to Kiev, my wife's hometown, where I served as a Marine Guard at the U.S. Embassy, to Mogadishu. That was my last real field assignment with the United Nations. But the part of the book that I found myself thinking about most in the last few months is actually based somewhere I never actually lived, where I'm from New Orleans. And you can tell I'm actually from New Orleans because I say New Orleans and not New Orleans. You see, my dad was career Air Force. I could give you the years that he served, but I think it's more interesting to discuss people's military careers in terms of U.S. foreign policy. So my dad served from the end of the Vietnam era straight through to the Balkans. As Air Force brats, my brothers and I only visited New Orleans during holidays. While shuttling between the houses of my more than 24 first cousins, we would pass the Desire projects in the city's 9th Ward. My father reminded us of the shootout the Black Panther Party had with the police there back in 1970, when he'd been a junior in high school. In New Orleans, the Panthers conducted classes and provided free breakfast for children who attended school in the platoon system. That's half of the kids would go from 8 to 12, and the other half would go from 1 to 4. The Panthers established a sickle cell screening program and instituted a neighborhood cleanup schedule. But more than simply replacing the services of an absentee state and corroborating the injustice of the community's daily existence, the Panthers legitimized a feral sort of Black masculinity. Yes, many were misogynistic, arrogant, and dangerously naive, but they were also young, Black, and unafraid. Motivated by dignity and a disdain for hopelessness, they preached violent self-defense and were uninterested in integration. In 1968, then director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, called the Panthers the greatest threat to internal security of the country. Through its COINTELPRO program, the Bureau brought the full force, ingenuity, and resources of the US government to bear on the Black Panther Party. From the roof of the Broussard Grocery on Piety Street, just outside the Desire Projects, New Orleans Police Department snipers had shot and killed my father's former classmate, 19-year-old Kenneth James Borden, KJ for short. Borden's involvement with the Panthers remains disputed, but whether he was armed when he was shot does not. He wasn't. In Showdown in Desire, Orissa Arend contends that one resident of the Desire development was killed by covering police fire, provided for an undercover officer fleeing the scene. The undercover officer mentioned was a New Orleans Police Department plant in the New Orleans chapter of the Black Panther Party. My father filled us, his sons, in on the bits that were left out of the official accounts of the shootout, like how KJ's corpse lay face down in a puddle of blood for 2.5 hours while New Orleans Police Department snipers remained in overhead watch and uniformed police waited for an armored vehicle to buttress their courage enough to enter the neighborhood on foot. Meanwhile, KJ's corpse drained to the gutter. It was almost 10 o'clock at night when 3 teenage Desire residents, a girl and 2 boys, braved the snipers who had already opened fire in the neighborhood to half drag and half carry the young man's corpse to the police lined up outside the projects. Imagine that moment of absolute clarity when those Black children face those police officers on the edge of their neighborhood. These are the stories that communities do not forget. Memories, reminders, lessons that filter like bad blood through a people's collective consciousness, a sort of anger that becomes a family heirloom. So for my novel, I tried my hand at historical fiction, and I built the first chapter out of this event. And I'll stop there.
Well, you know, that shootout scene at the beginning was so vivid and really, you know, drew me immediately into the story and into your storytelling. And here it was based on an actual event. When you were talking to your dad about this, was he emotional about remembering this experience? What was his, like, you know, as he was sharing it with you, and how did that sort of drive your writing at the same time?
It was a story that we grew up with. Like I said, we drive by the Desire projects. This is all before Katrina, and he would mention it. So it almost felt like folklore or legend or something that he wanted us to be aware of. He was very, very, he was conflicted in many ways, my father, before he passed on. I wouldn't call him patriotic. He had a lot of esprit de corps for the units that he served within the Air Force, but his patriotism was muted. He understood that he earned something through his service that he wouldn't have had citizenship-wise otherwise. So it felt like when he talked about that particular event, it felt like it was something he wanted us to know about, something he wanted us to be aware of as we grew up and made our way through the world.
Mm-hmm. You did a great job of taking it onto the page. You've also got 2 chapters of the novel that are set in the Ukraine. Now, what is your connection to that country?
Ukraine. My connection is right over there. It's my wife, actually. So, when I was in the Marine Corps, I applied for the Embassy Guard program as soon as possible, which at that time you had to be a corporal. You had to make non-commissioned officer to apply for it. So I applied for the MC Guard program. The first embassy I served at was in the Middle East, in Amman, Jordan. And the second one, you get a choice. And my first choice was Moscow. My second choice was St. Petersburg. My third choice was Vladivostok, which is in the east of Russia. And my fourth choice is Kiev. And anyone that knows anything about the Marine Corps knows that the way things go, there's a good chance you're going to get your fourth choice. So I got Kiev. Yeah.
So there's where the connection goes. Also, one of the chapters in the novel is set in the MMA world in New York and New Jersey. And what draws you to write about fighting like that?
Well, it's actually I served in Ukraine. I learned Russian. And then when I left the Marine Corps, I went back and I got my master's degree. I worked at the Pentagon for a little while and ended up working for the United Nations. So when I was working for the United Nations, my first field assignment, because I spoke Russian, was to Chechnya, to the Caucasus. So when I served in the Caucasus, I went to the gym in the Caucasus, and I was the only Black person in that town, in that region. I was a celebrity in many ways, and I would box at the gym. And I'm an okay boxer, I'm fine, but these guys were really, really good. And so it became every day someone would want to box me, and I would get worn out every single day I was there, and I couldn't stop going. So I really got into fighting when I was in the Caucasus. I have a great love for fighting. It's a sport that I love.
You still do? You still practice?
No.
No.
No,
age or a lack of time? It's a lack of time, right?
It's age, ma'am. It is age. Yeah. I train my kids to strike. My daughter's a very good striker. The boy's coming along. But no, I don't hit the mat anymore. Yeah, not anymore. Just do yoga.
You can write about it, and you can also strike the keys. So that's really what we're looking forward to seeing more from you.
Close enough. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Next up, we have Marie Benedict. Marie is the author of The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, let's see if we can both hold up. So here we go. Let me see which way. There we go. The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, which will be out on December 29th. And I caution any of you that have a galley, please note that the date has changed. There was a January date there, so the release date was moved up. No dates have moved this fall. Nothing's changed. So this is just something special. You know exactly what I mean. So Marie is a lawyer with more than 10 years experience as a litigator at two of the country's premier law firms. But she found her calling unearthing complex and fascinating women of history whose contributions have been overlooked. Her prior works include The Other Einstein, yes, looking at the wife of Einstein, Carnegie's Maid, The Only Woman in the Room, where she looks at Hedy Lamarr, and we learn that she is an inventor, not just a gorgeous actress, and Lady Clementine, and yes, I learned to pronounce that correctly, who is the story of Clementine Churchill. In The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, she looks at the events of 1926 that surrounded Agatha Christie's 11-day disappearance. It's a book that I feel will be of interest to mystery readers as well as those who love historical fiction. So Marie, tell us about The Mystery of Mrs. Christie.
Thank you, Carol, for such a nice introduction. Before I start, I just want to say two things, if that's okay. First of all, to Dewaine, thank you for sharing your own experiences in the genesis of your historical fiction. Those untold pieces of history are really one of my major fascinations. So I just wanted to thank you for sharing that with us. And I want to say thank you to all the independent booksellers out there. These are crazy, challenging times. And I feel like, wow, books can really provide us solace. They can connect us with people when we're feeling isolated, and they can hopefully inspire us in some ways. And so I thank you for bringing me here today to talk with Carol, who I love, and all these wonderful, wonderful authors. So The Mystery of Mrs. Christie. Carol was sweet enough to mention my other books. And if some of you out there are familiar with those books, then you know that I'm a writer on a mission. I am on a mission to really excavate from the past the most important, fascinating, complex women of history. and bring their stories out into the light of modern day, where we can really understand the vast breadth of their contributions, really come to learn how they came to be the incredible women that they are, and really learn from the insights that they can bring to modern day issues. You know, we often think about historical women as being so different from ourselves, but in fact, they aren't, and they weren't. They really dealt with a lot of the same quandaries, problems, issues that we deal with today. And as I kind of do this in my books, I really kind of think of myself as an archaeologist, kind of digging into the past, bringing out these women and their stories, and hopefully, if I do my job right, offering a fresh lens for us to really look at the past, and then take that lens, I hope, and look at our present and our future really differently, see the women really differently. So how did I come to this mission? It was a circuitous long route, as Carol knows all too well. I spent a long time, I like to think of them as dog years, as a lawyer in New York City. And I never really started out wanting to be a writer. You know, a lot of writers do. They feel that pull from a young age. I was the crazy, voracious reader kid who was lucky enough to have this incredible aunt who was a poet, an English professor, kind of a rebellious nun in her own right. And she really made it her business to give me the best literature that there was out there. And one of her abiding principles was to give me a different perspective on the past, to give me an initiation into women's voices. And there was this one book that kind of set me on this path. It's Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon, which is groundbreaking for its time, not so much today, but a retelling of the Arthurian legend from the point of view of the women. And it started me thinking about the women in history, with their voices, why I hadn't been told about these women. And I started on the path with a long, long detour as a lawyer to really unearthing these women and their stories and their histories. And once I kind of started on the path after my long detour, I feel like I've developed an antenna for these women. And it was really that desire to view women through a different lens, to rewrite them and their contributions back into the narrative, that led me to write about Agatha Christie, who in fact was one of the writers that my aunt, my beloved aunt, had given to me. Unlike a lot of the historical women I write about who are unknown and who I really got to dig from the detritus of the past, where they've been lost for generations, Agatha Christie's a little different. She is one of those women who's obviously really well known. She's famous. She's the most successful author of all time. She has sold over 2 billion copies of her books. If you can get your head around that as a bookseller, that's crazy. And she's credited really with creating the modern mystery novel in many ways. Her books still sell. We all know that. They keep on being made into different films. There's a big film coming out this fall. Anniversaries around Agatha Christie continue to be celebrated, including this year is the 100th anniversary of the publication of her first book, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. But what really fascinated me about Agatha wasn't just her legacy and her skill set. It was about her real life, which is really what often fascinates me about the women, and her origin, how she came to be this most influential of women. And when I learned that there was a real life mystery that surrounded her, I started to develop a sense that the resolution of that mystery might help us understand how she rose up to become the celebrated writer that she was. So what was the mystery, right? It's, as Carol intimated, it happened in 1926 in December. Agatha actually disappeared. She vanished. She lived in a house called Styles after her first novel in Surrey, England. Her car, a Morris Cowley, was found running on the edge of a cliff that overlooked a still, deep lake called the Silent Pool. Her belongings were scattered around, including this heavy fur coat, which would have been very helpful on that frigid December night. But Agatha herself was nowhere to be found. And her husband, a World War I pilot hero, and her young daughter had no idea where she was. The largest manhunt in England's history was launched to find her. Hundreds and then thousands of people, volunteers, combed the area where her car was found. There were sightings, supposed sightings of her all across England. All sorts of police forces got involved trying to track her down. Bloodhounds were loosened on the different sites of her alleged sightings. And the police even enlisted the services of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, to try and find her, all without any insights. The newspapers got whipped into a frenzy when they learned that on the night of Agatha's disappearance, her husband, Colonel Archibald Christie, had chosen not to go for the weekend away with her, but had chosen to stay at a friend's house for a golf weekend with another woman, who then became rumored to be his mistress, whether or not that was true. 11 harrowing days were dedicated to finding her. And then just as suddenly as she disappeared, she reappeared on the 11th day with no explanation, and there's never been a reason for her disappearance or a description of what happened to her. So I've always been a huge fan of hers as a mystery novelist. And when I learned about this piece of history, which really seemed torn from the pages of one of her own books, I couldn't help but go down that crazy rabbit hole of research that I always do. And I started to have a lot of questions. I started to wonder what really happened to her during those 11 days missing. Did she disappear by her own hand, or did she disappear by somebody else's? And I started to wonder whether she was running from her life or was she was trying to create an entirely new one. And most of all, the most pervasive thought I started to have was about the role that Agatha herself might have played in her disappearance and the reasons behind it. You know, when she disappeared, she wasn't the world famous mystery novelist that we know today. She was a burgeoning young novelist on the rise. She had just published her third book, the groundbreaking The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which of course is like the quintessential unreliable narrator book. And as I reread this book during my research, I was really struck by the mastery of its plotting, in particular that deft use of the unreliable narrator. And I started to think that surely a writer this talented in the art of plotting, this expert at creating masks behind which her characters can hide, couldn't have just been a victim in her own vanishing. Could she have crafted her disappearance as skillfully as she crafted her mysteries? And I started to wonder whether she might have used this strange incident as a vehicle to serve whether personal or professional aims. And this was really the genesis behind the mystery of Mrs. Christie. I envisioned Agatha as that rare example of a historical woman who was able to escape from the confines of her own period, those sort of limitations that were placed upon women, to write herself back into the historical narrative, to really take history into her own hands and shape it for herself. Thank you so much, everybody, Siba and Neba, for having me today. And I'd love to talk with Carol or you all afterwards about the book.
You know, I just have one question. What differences did you see between Agatha within the manuscript and Agatha who's at the end of the book? Like that she actually changes as time goes on through the story.
He does. I think in many ways it's the evolution of Agatha as a woman, as a young, when the book begins, which is reflective of the beginning of Agatha's life, she's a relatively innocent, very naive young woman of relative affluence, even though her family's kind of down on their luck. She comes from a very affluent background, not aristocratic, but well-to-do. And she kind of has bought into all of the things that society has told her about her life, that she'll find the perfect man, that will be her life, this perfect marriage. And as time goes on and things change, both within her marriage and within herself, she starts to develop real talent and a sense of her own ambition. And she starts to get these messages from society that's not okay, that you should kind of redirect your attentions back to your husband. She starts to kind of evolve and take charge of her own experience, her own really history, and shape things in a way that she wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. She's very different at the end of the book as she is in the beginning.
Yeah.
As we all are throughout the course of our lives. It's really reflective of all of our journeys in some ways.
But it's just so interesting because you think of this person that, like, really, what did happen during that time? Either that or was it the greatest publicity stunt of all time? Which author will disappear next? Except during the pandemic, no one would really miss you. They just figure you were at the food store or something like that.
Right, exactly. If I start to disappear, then get worried, Carol, please.
Exactly. They would definitely say, Mom, where's dinner? Like, let's get serious.
You know that. You know my kids.
Exactly. Thank you, Marie. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me today.
And now let's welcome Michael Farris Smith, whose book, Nick, his 6th novel, will be out on January 5th. Can you hold up the cover, Michael? I don't have a copy of this one. So I just want everyone, this is a really iconic looking cover, folks. I mean, it's absolutely stunning. You're going to remember this one for sure. Michael is an award-winning writer whose novels appeared on Best of Heroes lists with Esquire, Southern Living, Book Riot, and numerous others, and have been named Indie Next and Barnes & Noble Discover selections. He has been a finalist for the Southern Book Prize, the Gold Dagger Award in the UK, and the Grand Prix des, we'll blow it. Like Teresa? I can do it like Teresa's?
Sure, that's good.
Okay, in France, okay. Each of his last novels, 3 novels, Desperation Road, The Fighter, and Blackwood, have been optioned for film, and Michael is serving as screenwriter for each project. He lives in Oxford, Mississippi with his wife and daughters. Welcome, Michael, and tell us about Nick.
Thank you, Carol. It's nice to be here. It's kind of strange to say be here, but I guess we all are kind of here in some strange way. Tell you about Nick. Well, I don't know, man. It's like you just never know what's waiting around the corner in art or in life, hiding for you and just waiting to pounce on you. It's such kind of a long and winding road. And Nick has been part of that for me, part of my writing life, and I think just my life in general, almost an accidental stumble upon the idea for doing this. I read Gatsby 3 times in my life. The first time I read it, I was in college when I was a very serious C+ student. And I remember reading it and kind of tossing it aside and thinking, I don't get it, or I don't see what the big deal is. Then the next time I picked it up and read it was about 5 years later, and I was actually living abroad at that time. When I was 25 years old, I actually ended up going and living in Geneva, Switzerland, and working a job doing outdoor basketball festivals with the NBA. So we were traveling around from all over Western Europe doing these little outdoor festivals. And as I was on the trains and the cafes and in my apartment, because of the reading gap, what I started to do was read a lot to fill up the time, which is I'd never been, much of a reader before. But I saw people reading in Europe. That's something that, I kind of noticed. So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And then later our office moved to Paris, and I moved there too. And I knew enough about like the expatriates and the whole kind of movement there and everything that was going on. I got really interested in it. So I started reading all those Lost Generation writers. So I picked up Gatsby again and I read it again while I was there. And this time it kind of moved me in a little different way. And I felt like I really related to Nick. I was getting to be like 28, 29 years old, which is the age he is when he's telling us the story of Gatsby. And I think the way I thought about things and things that I had experienced from my age of like 20 to the age of being 30 or 28 or 29, I had really kind of shifted and moved, which I could feel that in reading him also. But still, I kind of put the novel away and I didn't think about it much. But what happened was when I was done living abroad, I came back to the States and I was 29 years old and I came back to Mississippi and something had just moved in me over the course of time, and I thought, I think I want to try to write. So I did. I was a little bit behind, I felt like, but that's when I kind of set off to do it. So you fast forward 13 years later until my first novel, Rivers, had come out, and I was sitting there looking for something to read one day at my house, and I just picked up Gatsby, and I said, I don't really remember much about this, but I'm gonna read it. I want to see how it feels now. And when I read it, it was, one of those reading experiences you have that you just almost never forget, when something just connects with you about a book or a story or a character. And it was almost like every page was like speaking to me in some way. And then I got toward the end of the book when Nick realizes he's turning 30, and he describes it as the portentous, menacing road of a new decade. and he describes it as a decade of loneliness. And I immediately stopped reading, and I closed the book, and I thought about myself when I was that age, when I was 29, when I was coming back to Mississippi, when all my friends had gotten married, they were having children, they had jobs, they had houses now. And here I was deciding that I'm going to try to write. And I had no idea what that even meant, and how alienated I felt, and kind of how lonesome I think it felt very often too. And how I was here, on the edge of 30, and it was a complete decade of uncertainty stretching out before me. And I kind of thought about that. And I thought sitting there reading Gatsby at that point, I thought about all that had happened to me since that time. I kind of, I started writing, I suffered through it, I learned how to do it, I had some success, I got married, I had 2 daughters. So much had happened to me during that time. And I remember finishing the book and setting it aside, and I was thinking about Nick a lot over the next couple days. I just seemed to relate to him so much, and I realized I didn't know anything about him except for the 3 things he tells us about himself: that he's 30, he fought in the war, and that he's from the Midwest. And the thought crossed my mind, it'd be cool if somebody wrote a novel about Nick. And it was as if, one of those questions you ask yourself, but you answer it before you even get finished answering. And I thought, well, why don't you just do it? And I'll admit, it absolutely scared the hell out of me, because I knew, from the moment I had the thought, that I was going to do it, no matter, what happened. It was either embrace it and love it, realizing the weight of it, the literary heft of it all, and give it everything I had to try to do it, or suppress it and put it aside, be scared of the idea, and always wonder what it might be like. And so that was a pretty easy decision for me. So I just dove in and began to explore. And I guess that's kind of why we're sitting here talking about it now.
Yeah, it was interesting because you only did know those 3 things, and I didn't think about it. I actually was upstairs looking for my copy of The Great Gatsby earlier today, because it made me want to go back and look and see. Really, we were looking through his lens, but we didn't really know that much about him. It's like the narrator that you didn't know that much about, yet he was the one his lens was telling us the story. You're known as a writer of Southern fiction, and what expatriate influence led you to Nick? What, drove you? Was it just coming back and saying, okay, I'm here now?
I think it's a feeling that you never really lose once you get it. Once I lived abroad and felt that expatriate feeling, which you can't even really, unless you've experienced, it's hard to explain, and got interested in Hemingway and just the whole thing, Sylvia Beach's bookstore, everything about Paris and Gertrude Stein, and all the artists were there. I mean, I've just always kind of felt the feeling that I'm not quite sure where I belong, I think. And so I think when I went back to Nick, I did remember that about it when I sat down to read it that 3rd time. And I was like, maybe feeling, I think once you feel that way, I think it's a hard thing to shake. I even feel that way now a little bit, and I probably always, will. I think that's what brought me back around to it. And I think that's why when I began to read it, I began to be real curious about what makes Nick the way he is. He's such a wallflower, and he's just so standoffish, but something brought him to that. And I really, in my mind, I began to create him. Something brought him to being 30 years old and standing there and almost forgetting it was his birthday, while everything was crumbling around him, and his attitudes and his ideals and everything and his worldview, it was all just crumbling around him. And something brought him to that. And so I just decided to walk him right up to the edge of it, see what his life had been like.
Yeah. This is also your first historical work. And did it change the process much for you as you were doing that? Because all of a sudden you needed to know something about a different place and time as well.
Right. I think I mentioned my solid C+ standing as a college student. So I've never been a big fan of homework. So this was different, having to stop and start and make sure somebody was smoking the right kind of cigarette, or do refrigerators exist, or what is going on. So that was kind of interesting for me. But I was writing about I had to do some homework in World War I too, because the novel begins with Nick trying to survive the war. He's in the trenches and the grenades are exploding around him. And so there was the World War I to read about and find out about a little bit. And then I wrote about his experience in Paris, and then him coming back to the States and not wanting to go home and ending up in New Orleans. So it turned out to be a little fascinating to me to be able to read about Paris and New Orleans, and like also about World War I, which I didn't know a lot about, to kind of get to this. Different experience, but also kind of, once I put those pieces together, I think it also became the same experience of pushing characters and story all the way to the edge just to see what you can get out of it.
Yeah, and I think the landscapes of Paris and New Orleans lent so much to the story as well, because you have these very rich places that you were able to write him into and see, how did he walk those streets? What happened to him while he was there? What were the influences of those places? And I felt very strongly about that too.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a tie-in of my experience as a writer, both with the expatriate influence, but then also my Southern influence, and the writers that have really influenced me, like Cormac McCarthy and Larry Brown and Flannery O'Connor and Carson McCullers and some of those writers, William Gay, Faulkner, you know, where landscape is its own living, breathing thing. It's a character in itself. And I've always been so drawn to those stories where the place comes to life. And like to have the ability to write about Paris and New Orleans during that time period, and to make them dark and atmospheric and moody, and to give them their own heartbeat, was really both challenging and also very rewarding. It's something I look forward to, like every time I sat down with it.
You'd sit down with a cocktail in both locations, not a problem whatsoever.
Not a problem at all, no.
Thank you so much, Michael, for making me think about rereading The Great Gatsby as well as finishing Nick.
Good, thanks very much.
Next, we have Chris Whitaker, whose new novel, We Begin at the End, will be coming from Henry Holt on March 9th. Now, many of you may have heard Amy Einhorn, his editor and publisher, speaking so highly about this book earlier this week. I know I was even more interested in talking to Chris after I heard her give this great pitch. He's the award-winning author of Tall Oaks and All the Wicked Girls. Both books were published to widespread critical acclaim, with Tall Oaks going on to win the CWA John Christie New Blood Dagger Award. He lives just outside London with his wife and 3 children, and when not writing, he works part-time at a local library where he gets to surround himself with books, which I just think sounds fabulous. So Chris, tell us about We Begin at the End.
Hi, Carol. Thank you for having me. Can I just say, I could have listened to Michael talk for hours. It's the best accent ever. We Begin at the End, and Michael's book as well. Right, so We Begin at the End. We Begin at the End follows 13-year-old Duchess. She lives in a small town in Southern California, and she's kind of a carer to her younger brother and to her mum, who has all sorts of problems, like with addiction, things like that. And 30 years prior, her mum's ex-boyfriend went to prison for murder. And we kind of pick up the story with him returning to this small town that they live in, and Duchess is terrified that he's going to create loads of trouble for her. You know, her situation is so fragile already. And so she takes action, and what she does is, I won't say what she does, but in doing so, she kind of sets off this chain of events that ripple throughout the whole story and have these devastating consequences. But it's kind of, the book it's commercial fiction, but it's been put in loads of different categories. Some people say it's a mystery, a thriller, literary, a love story, which I love. I think it's a coming of age story more than anything else. It's probably a book about sacrifices that people make for those that they love. It's about making mistakes and learning to deal with them. And I'd say it's a book that has heart more than anything.
Definitely. I mean, when I sat there and I was thinking about this story, first of all, I love Duchess. I actually love this character because she's spunky. She's going to do everything that she can to do what she needs to get done in life, whether it's on the right side of the law or not. And she is just standing up to everybody from like page 1. It's just, this is what I'm going to do. How much fun did you have writing that character?
Yeah. Oh, so much fun. Well, I say fun. It was kind of agony as well. It was like years and years of, research. And I probably spent a solid year just writing her dialogue and working on her. And I read a lot of young adult and teen fiction, which helped massively. But yeah, she kind of became my everything. She's kind of completely lost as well, because she's got no, she doesn't know who her father is. So she's got no real identity. And then she gets a school project to research her family tree, and she finds a link, a like really tenuous link to a wanted outlaw from a long time ago. And she kind of grabs onto it, and she runs with it, you know. So every time she needs to be brave, she kind of puffs up her chest and says, I'm an outlaw, and uses it to excuse some of her behavior as well, which is bad, isn't it, throughout the book?
Well, it's interesting. Like, she can make going home from school into like a complete plot twist of like, you know, bash this one, do this, do that. It's like a little, I felt like she was this little outlaw desperado as she was walking along the streets with her own kind of attitude about everything that was going on. It's just, you know, wonderful. What drew you to write this book? What was the catalyst?
So I had a kind of strange route into writing. So Michael said he was a C student, is that right? A C grade student. I was probably an E or a D or an E, and I messed up my exams. I went out drinking the night before my economics exam and missed the exam the next day. I was that kind of teenager, and I messed up my exams. My parents were thrilled, obviously, and then I kind of bounced from job to job. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I worked behind a bar for a while, sales, sold cars, worked in a bakery, got fired from the bakery for eating cakes, amazingly. And then I was working as a real estate agent, and I was out posting leaflets through people's doors. And someone came up to me and asked if they could borrow my phone. And I kind of knew, growing up in London, I kind of knew this was going to be bad. But being stupid and 19 and kind of fearless, I thought, you know, he's not that big, I'll fight him off. And I was doing okay, and then he pulled out a kitchen knife. And yeah, so people that have heard this story before say that the knife gets bigger every time I tell it, but it doesn't. So he pulled out a sword, and no, he didn't really. So it was a kitchen knife, pulled out a kitchen knife and stabbed me 3 times in the side, and dropped the knife, I dropped the phone, he picked up both, and ran off and kind of left me standing there bleeding. And I got myself to the hospital, and they stitched me back together. And that's when the kind of real trouble began. That's my dad kind of slapped me on the back and, you know, kind of man up, be a man, dust yourself down and get on with it. And I couldn't really work out why I couldn't. And looking back, I think it was some kind of PTSD. I mean, I couldn't eat or sleep, or yeah, I just couldn't do anything. And I'd go out running, and I'd run so far that I'd have to get a bus back home. I was really in a bad way. And I was kind of contemplating doing something drastic, and I wrote a note to my parents, and it wasn't like a goodbye or anything. I just wanted to write something down to explain why, like how I was feeling. And I found it really helped. And it was the first time I'd written anything since school. And then I found a book in the library, and it talked about, you know, there's a technique where you can take the event that's caused you all this trauma, and you can change the characters involved and write about it and turn it into fiction. And that I changed myself to a different character, and that character was Duchess all those years ago, when I was 19. And it kind of got me through a really difficult time. It was like writing as therapy. And so I put the book to one side. It wasn't really a book, it was just a collection of writing. And then I went, saw an article about a stockbroker, and this guy earned loads of money. And I thought, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to be next. So even though my results were terrible, my CV was awful, I kind of marched into the city and talked my way into an entry-level job. And I loved it. I was happy. You know, I'd met a girl, got engaged, and then I worked my way up onto a trading desk, and my boss said to me, if you lose $20,000, you stop trading, and we talk about what went wrong. And then, so on my first day, I kind of went in there full of energy and lost $2 million straight away, and hid it because I thought I could make it back, which is just ridiculous because I wasn't very good. And then I hid it for a while, lost some more money, came in one morning, and my boss and kind of a load of lawyers were sitting around a table waiting for me because they had found out what had happened. And at this point, I'd started making money again. So they gave me a contract, and they said, if you sign this, you know, we won't go to the police, we won't tell anyone. And the contract said that I had to personally pay them back $1 million, which I didn't have, obviously. So I signed it, went home, didn't tell my wife anything, because I had this perception that I was doing really well. And I was in $1 million worth of debt, and we were planning this big wedding because she thought I was doing really well, so the wedding costs were spiraling. And it was just so stressful. It was such a difficult time. And I picked up this book again, this Duchess character, and I started writing, and it helped me through it a second time. And I made it back, took years, paid it back. And it was around my 30th birthday. And I just read a book called The Last Child by John Hart, which I absolutely loved. And I Googled John Hart and found an interview with him. And he talked about how he was a really successful lawyer. And he just quit his job because he wanted to write a book. So my boss called me in my 30th birthday, offered me a big promotion, and I quit my job there and then without telling my wife, who was pregnant at the time. Got home and told my wife I'm going to be a writer now, which just is ridiculous. It's... I didn't know what I was doing, don't know how to write a book, have no qualifications, no reason to think I can. And then I started writing, and I really loved it. But I didn't pick up this book again. I didn't pick up We Begin at the End and Duchess because it was difficult. It was hard to read it back without kind of going back to those times. But I did eventually. And then I met Amy Einhorn, who kind of transformed the book into the book that I wanted to write all this time. And then John Hart read it and sent me a note, and it was like the best time ever. And that's my life story.
There's your life story. That's what happened. It's funny because I was at a different conference this morning and John Hart was there, and he was talking about character is what drives his writing. It's character first. And I see the parallel of you saying the character comes first for you as well, because it was clearly the character of Duchess and then like what to do with her from there. Mm-hmm. So why did you choose to set the book in the U.S.? You thought you had a new landscape over here. You weren't a wanted man. I mean, was that it?
No, loads of reasons. So I grew up reading American crime writers like Dennis Lehane, John Grisham, and I read massive fan of Stephen King and watch all the TV shows. And it's such a great setting for crime fiction. Over here we're kind of fascinated with small town sheriffs and the FBI, things like that. And but more than that, it turned into a really big story, and it felt like I needed a really big canvas to tell it on. And the US is like a world within a country, and it just wouldn't have worked anywhere else.
So that's where you came here, and then you can just figure out how to research it from there. So, folks, these have been 4 fascinating conversations. I want to see if there are questions from the audience. I'm going to take a look right now because this is that moment.
Should I disappear again?
Let me see if I have a question for you. I have to disappear for the moment.
Okay.
We may have you back. Hold on one second. For Michael, I'm dying to know, when you wrote Nick, since Blackwood just came out, did you dive right into it after Blackwood, or did you take a break, or were working on it on and off through the years?
It's been such a weird experience, this novel, all the way around, because I wrote Nick in 14 and 15, right before Desperation Road. And I didn't tell anybody I was writing it. I didn't tell my agent, I didn't tell my editor, I didn't tell anybody, because I didn't want to be told it was impossible. So when I turned it in, that's when I realized the copyright to Gatsby had not expired and was not going to expire. It couldn't be published until the January 1st, 2021. So Nick has literally been sitting there quietly, and we've all been sitting here very quietly for 5 years with it. And in the meantime, I wrote, published Desperation Road and The Fighter and Blackwood. And once I got done writing Blackwood, to kind of circle back to the question, I sat down and opened up Nick and went through and did the revisions to it. So it's been kind of laying low for a while, but I didn't revise it actually until I got finished with Blackwood.
Terrific. Marie, would your new book work as a good book club selection? It sounds like a good book to have a discussion about at a book group. And I'm also thinking that everybody in the book group could win a different Christie, read a different Christie book, and then bring that to the table as well. So that could be fun. So you answer, though, your question. I think you have to unmute.
Idea. First of all, Carol, I like your idea. That's really a good one. I like it. And thank you for asking the question. I like to think it would make for really good book group discussion for a couple different reasons. First of all, I didn't talk about this when I talked about sort of the genesis of the book, but it's actually written as a mystery. It's written in alternating chapters. It's written almost as Agatha's life story as a manuscript. It's very much in keeping with my other books, sort of the origin story of the woman, but interwoven in those chapters is her husband. And we are counting down the 11 days till she emerges. And on that 11th day, something happens. And Agatha emerges, and a very different story emerges as well. And I think it would make, for a lot of the reasons that I think my books make really good book group discussions. I think I purposely pick women, of course, that are dealing with very modern day issues, right? So things that women and men, male readers as well, can really relate to. And it provides sort of an interesting perspective, a historical perspective on those same issues. It gives us sort of an understanding of the sort of the long lead of these women's contributions. And that's true in this book as well. But there's also something else here, I think, Carol. It's the question of what's real and what's not. Mm-hmm. The question of the unreliable narrator. This book was written right after she wrote, this event occurred right after she wrote The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which is honestly I think one of the best unreliable narrator books there is. And that element is very much at play here. And it really raises a lot of questions about in what way we are unreliable narrators of our own lives. Mm-hmm. In what way do we revise our own histories every single day, but in ways both large and small? And in what way is Agatha an unreliable narrator of her own life? As we kind of sift out what's true and what's not true, and we watch her rise up and claim her legacy. So there's a lot of facets to the book, a lot of which kind of relate in many ways to my other books, but there really is a new kind of fresh layer to her story this time, I think.
Yeah, because we're unwrapping her at the same time. We're unwrapping the mystery of what's going on.
And we're unwrapping ourselves and looking at the way I think that we do that. We come up with our own narration of our own history and sort of spin out who we are as it relates to who we're going to be going forward. So I think it hopefully raises a lot of interesting conversations.
Yeah, I'm sure Chris could relate to that too, as he reinvented himself. Next question is for Dewaine. You vary chapters between the third, second, and first person narrators. Did that structure emerge for you, or was that something you set out to do right from the beginning?
Yeah, I landed on that as I was writing. It kind of gave different narrators tryouts. I felt like it was tryouts. The one that I was most resistant to initially was the fight chapter, which is done in the second person, which is an oddity in literature. People tend to think about Bright Lights, Big City when they think about a second person narration. That's the book that comes to mind most immediately. My favorite is Buffalo Soldiers, which is another good second person narrative. But I think the one that influenced me most was probably Lori Moore has a short story called How to Become a Writer. And it made me start to think of the second person POV as a kind of a shameful I, like you're talking in the first person, but with some kind of disconnect. So I landed on that for fighting, for the fight chapter. And I really think that's because fighting is a sport that, because it's not a team sport, it's an individual sport, it invites shame in a way that other sports don't. And that voice really worked well for that chapter, the one on fighting.
Yeah, it's like, moving the points of view around really changed the story as I was reading as well. It's like, wait a second. And it also made me stay into the story more because I was trying to figure out what you were doing. So it was that kind of a play as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was I think that switching from different points of view gives a novel a feel almost like a collection, a linked collection of short stories, Mm-hmm. So
that's exactly.
I think that the voices I landed on are the ones that tell the stories best.
They definitely told those stories best. we flip back to Chris for a moment? I want to know, since you're not from the States, how did you go about doing this research? You know, because I know you had such great grades. I'm sure that the ones that really came through were these research grades at this point.
Okay, so I work in the library, local library, and spend most of my time there kind of researching, reading travel guides, things like that, and just from reading in general. And I have an amazing editorial team that kind of saved me, stopped me looking stupid. Like a copy editor will catch all of the kind of Americanisms that I mess up. You know, like I might write windscreen or something like that, whereas you'd say windshield. And my first book, Tall Oaks, I wrote years ago, and that was littered with mistakes. You know, there were so many of them. They really earned their money, the team on that one. But by this one, I'm better, but I live in fear of someone pointing out something dreadful that I've missed. But I tend to, I make up the towns as well, which gets me out of a bit of trouble. I like to create completely. I will drop down the town into a real location, but within the town, you know, it's all kind of fictional. So
yeah, fictional from there. Yeah, and you have that moment where at the beginning there's a real estate gig that's going on at the same time as well. That somebody is trying to really build up this community, and there's this one house at the end of the road, and everybody wants that house to be gone. And you just evoke just I can actually see that space. I can see walking down that road, and there's this eyesore on the end, but it's someone's home. And if someone says, I love it, and I'm going to stand in your way to doing another one of your, you know, McMansion kinds of things.
Yeah. So I have a kind of strange writing process where I start with a visual image, and then I kind of write down exactly what I can see in my mind, and then I'll find pictures that match it, and I work across 3 screens, and then I'll build out the scene. And I kind of do that for every scene in the book, just because it's so important to me that you know, you can feel what I'm feeling.
Yeah, and definitely had me right in the moment on each of the scenes, you know, going through. And I do love Duchess, that little, okay, she's a badass kind of girl. Terrific. Well, I think we're just about out of time, and I don't want to go over. I want to thank everybody. If you could all pop back on screen. I absolutely loved chatting with you today. I am so looking forward to sharing these books with our readers. I'm so looking forward to seeing booksellers talking about these more. Appreciate your joining us today. For many of you, this is the first time I've gotten to know your work, and it's just been a fabulous experience. And I thank you for all you gave to this conversation as well.
Thank you.
You.
And for the,
Thanks so much.
for those attendees, there's some wonderful events for you to enjoy in the next few hours, just a few more hours left in this conference. One is The Way Forward, Meeting Crisis with Creativity with Ann Patchett, Elizabeth Gilbert, and Glennon Doyle in conversation at 6 o'clock tonight. So thanks to everyone for joining us today, and really look forward to seeing these books.